Hi, my name is Sarus Maravar. Thank you all for watching. For those of you who are on the internet, thank you for the audience that is back here and have generously come. Thank you again to our panelists. This is the first episode, get-together of what I like to call Tech Atlas SF. This is a forum on global tech issues, and today, because this week is the 40th anniversary of the ARPANET, the precursor to the internet, we have three distinguished panelists here with me. We have Katie Hafner. Hey, Katie.
Hey, Sarus.
We have Katie Hafner is the author of, where's your book? Of this book, Where Wizards Stay Up Late, which is a history of the internet, published in 1998 by Simon & Schuster, as I recall.
1996.
1996, my mistake. It's an excellent book. Over here we have Brewster Kahle, who is the founder of the Internet Archive, available at archive.org. How you doing, Brewster?
Well.
Great. And we also have Danny O'Brien, who's the International Outreach Coordinator. I think I've got that right.
Very nicely said, yes.
From the Electronic Frontier Foundation here in San Francisco. So welcome to you all, and welcome to our audience and those of you watching over the internet. On October 29th, 1969, according to Leonard Kleinrock, who was one of the early pioneers of the internet, back in a laboratory at UCLA, the first message was sent over the internet, and it's now what makes events like this possible. And so what I wanted to start off with tonight was to get Katie to give us, given that she's so heavily researched this topic, to give us kind of a brief 15-minute or so history of the ARPANET and the internet, and then Brewster will talk about what he's doing at the Internet Archive and where the internet might go in the future. Then we'll switch to a little discussion. Danny and I will pose some questions of our guests, and then we'll have some questions from the audience and hopefully questions from people who are watching online as well. So, Katie.
Well, let's see, 1996, how many years ago was that I wrote this book? In fact, I should say that when I pitched the book in 1993, it was my agent said, "What?" I said, "Well, it might be actually an interesting book," and he had no idea what I was talking about. And luckily, it turned out to be a really great story. And I should warn you that that what this book is about is, and I also brought the Japanese edition and the Italian edition, just in case anyone
to be international.
To be extremely international. It came out in a few other languages, but I couldn't find them at home. Anyway, it turns out to be the history of the ARPANET, the precursor to the internet. And what's very interesting about it is that it's a full story with all these characters. When I write, I like to focus on the people, because after all, what's most interesting is the people involved in a project. And the ARPANET turned out to be one of these cases of simultaneous invention, of where it's sort of one of these the time is ripe phenomena, where all the technological pieces were in place for something like the ARPANET to be created. There have been some misconceptions about the reason that the ARPANET was created. ARPA, of course, which has also been variously DARPA, the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, had an office at the time called IPTO. I'm going to try to make this interesting, which was, I know it's hard, which was called the Information Processing Techniques Office, and this is back in the early 60s. One of the misconceptions about the origins of the ARPANET is that it was purely a defense project whose purpose was to be able to communicate in the event of a nuclear attack. And I hope that we dispelled that myth in the very early pages of the book. And even though it was a Defense Department project, that was not the reason. And in fact, the reason it was created, I've always found far more interesting than that, which is that it was this very pure academic experiment. And it was an experiment in network research, in networking, in computer networking. But there were these things happening all at the same time. Now we're in the early 1960s. There was a researcher at the RAND Corporation down in Santa Monica named Paul Barron, who wrote this very interesting set of technical papers, many of which were classified, where he outlined this distributed system, which in fact entailed packet switching. And then there was a guy in England named Donald Davies who coined the term, who's unfortunately has died. And he, but we got to interview him before he died. He was a wonderful, wonderful guy. And he actually came up with the word packet, which was nice. That was his contribution. But it was in the IPTO office that these researchers, Larry Roberts from MIT and Bob Taylor, who was actually a psychologist but really good at getting things going, had this idea for this network. And so Larry, in fact, he has these amazing, or had these amazing doodles, where he went and he just sort of doodled these sketches of what he thought this thing should look like, what should the configuration be. And he, independently of Barron at Rand and Davies, came up with this distributed system. And so, then it got sent out for an RFP, or request for proposal, because they had to build a piece of hardware that would be what's kind of the modern day router, but it was this huge honking, this imp, called an imp, which was not exactly an imp, called an interface message processor, which was built. The people who got the contract, and this is like the littler guys won. Well, they were a little bit littler than IBM, because IBM had also a lot of companies bid on this. Anyway, they built this imp, and it gets actually in the book pretty dramatic, because they have this deadline. They have to come up with both the software and the hardware for this imp, and then they have to ship the imp out to the place that was going to be the very first node. And as you pointed out, it was at UCLA in Len Kleinrock's lab. And he had these two graduate students named Steve Crocker and Vint Cerf, and also John Postel, who was actually not at UCLA proper, but he was hanging around. And these kids were the ones who did it. I mean, Kleinrock, there's been sort of a lot of controversy about, who is the actual father of the ARPANET. We can get into that later, because I've written a lot about this in newspaper stories. But, how success has 1,000 fathers. But it was these kids at the time, well, young men, Vint and Steve and John, who were in this lab, and they sent what is considered to be the first message from that node up to SRI. And I spent a lot of time trying to find, who it actually was on the receiving end. And at the time, so some people say, oh, that was the first email. So now we're in 1969, and as you said, in October. And it's really funny how no one remembered, because at the time, it was nothing. It was just this little experiment. So anyway, this thing grew. It was a very small, kind of elite, sort of just universities, and it, as we know, it blossomed into this huge honking thing, which then became, thanks to TCP/IP, which stands for Transmission Control Protocol, Internet Protocol, which was done in 1973 by Vint Cerf, our hero, and Bob Kahn, another hero. And that's what gave us the internet, because we needed this way of going network to network. And that's kind of this, and then the thing absolutely, took off, so to speak, which is a huge understatement. And I've, sometimes when I talk, I ask people what they consider kind of the seminal event in the history of the internet to have been. And everyone comes up with a different answer, and I consider it to be the, I don't know if everyone remembers this, the Morris worm. Right. Robert Morris, the graduate student. We can talk about this later, because of what it told us about both the reach and the vulnerability of this network. Because if that Morris worm, and we can describe it later because I don't want to hog the time, if the Morris worm happened today, it would have affected 1 in every 10, if you do the math and extrapolate out, 1 in every 10 hosts on the network, which is an unbelievable number because of the damage that it did at the time, which was back in 1988, but I'll leave that for later. So that's a nutshell history.
All right. Well, thank you. I wanted to turn the floor over to Brewster to tell us a little bit about, you are in a way kind of with creating the Internet Archive, in a way kind of the curator of internet history, of web history, I guess you could say. can you tell us a little bit about how the Internet Archive got started, and how you see your work and your ideas, you know, and based on what we've learned about where the Internet and the web are going?
Yeah, there are these different ways of viewing the web, the net. You can think of it as a communication system, you can think of it as a library, you can think of it as these different sort of ways that people project themselves onto the net and what it's there for. And the dream that a bunch of us had was the library. And this was back at MIT back in the late 70s. And this, what was this thing going to be? Or actually wasn't what it was going to be. It was, what did we want to have happen? And we wanted the Library of Alexandria version 2. And there are a bunch of things that needed to happen to be able to get there.
That's a modest goal.
Yeah, it seemed like a good one. You know, it was sort of in the times when Marvin Minsky was saying we were going to build a artificial intelligence. But why don't we build the great library? If we're going to have smart machines, at least let's have them
well read.
Have them well read, because otherwise we'll end up bringing up a bunch of brats. So the idea was to bring something up that was interesting. And it took a while, first to sort of build computers good enough, and then build a system that allowed people to share information back and forth. But by the early 90s, we started having enough participation that it wasn't just kind of, do you want to have lunch, sort of transactions going on this open public network. And it was worthy trying to gather it. And so we started gathering the web in '96 by taking a snapshot of every publicly accessible website every 2 months. And back then it actually, well, let's see, when I first saw Alta Vista, which was the first real search engine, everything else is pretty much cloned since then. And that was the first bold move to actually have, can we bring everything all together and make it searchable? It was the size of 2 Coke machines down in Palo Alto, and it had 30 million web pages in it. That was sort of the size of the web. And you could put your arms around it, quite literally. So that was the size of the web. And so I was like, oh, okay, you can actually collect it all back up again, right? You don't actually have to have a distributed Library of Alexandria. You can actually hoover it back up again, which is sort of a interesting idea. So 6 months later, when we couldn't figure out how to work with Alta Vista, we said, all right, we'll just collect it ourselves. And so it started in '96, and it's now 150 billion web pages, growing at 4 billion web pages a month, which is about a Library of Congress a month. In terms of just the amount of stuff. And we thought that it was going to be kind of used as a library, right? Sort of, where there's sort of the commercial back and forth that would go on. But when we actually went and made it available to everybody for free in 2001, it started being used a lot more than we thought. Why? I mean, we thought that people would sort of go and, see their old websites, and every so often, and how often do you really want to do that? You do it, you sort of know it's there, thanks very much. It's an archive, right? But people started using it a lot more. It's used by about 500,000 people a day, which seems like a lot. And we don't really know why. I think it's because it's actually getting linked back into the present web, which is kind of interesting, because the average life of a web page is 100 days. So if you're going to try to build the library, you have to be really active this time. It used to be if you just ran paper archives, you just wait for the guy to die, and then you take over their stuff later. But now you've really got to be sort of in the flow and in the flux to be able to keep it going. So I think the past is sort of part of the present, and I think that's a real opportunity to be different from television, which was the plague of my youth, which was sort of perpetual present. It was perpetually recontextualized for a current audience. There was almost no way to reference things backwards in television. It would just happen and you missed it, and it was unscrutinizable.
And newspapers too. One of the things that always struck me about the newspaper industry was when I was working at The Guardian, there would be this incredible frenzy about today's newspaper. And of course, as a sort of internet head, I was like, well, where's the back issues, right? Where's your archivist? Where's your librarian? And they'd go, oh, they're down in the cellar somewhere, I guess. We phone them
Right.
up when we need the answer for a fact check. And you're sitting there going, so you're obsessed about today's news, and you have 300 years, 200 years of information
Yes.
that you don't realize is your greatest asset. So, yeah. So I'm struck by that we're talking about the 40 years of the internet here, being alive on the day that GeoCities died. Right, and you've seen this sort of echo around that GeoCities, one of the first sites that was a third party that enabled people to easily create their own home pages, and Yahoo just decided to shutter it down and seemed to be very defensive about letting anybody else have it. I mean, what are your feelings when some huge part of the internet disappears like that?
It always happens. I mean, if it's got a .com on the end of its email address, it's going to die. It's going to die a lot sooner than you think. Corporations are transient at best. But let's take GeoCities. GeoCities is a homesteading site that was sort of the place to go and make. It was the Facebook of its day, and it was the place that you went and added your things, and you thought it was going to be permanent, and you could go and link to it, and people did, but but it was part of a commercial entity, and it was sold to Yahoo, and they ran with it for much longer than I think it was at all economically warranted. But when they were going to shut it down, they put out the word, and they contacted the Internet Archive and said, this is going to happen. We can't tell you exactly when, but it's in many months. Go. And there's this back and forth to try to figure out what was the right way to archive it. Like, how much should they go and give over all of the URLs in it, because they'd know them? Should they package it up and hand it to us? And different corporations have had different policies about trying to preserve a legacy. And they decided to basically let us crawl faster than you can through the front door. So they, and we've got millions and millions of URLs from there. We don't have all of them, but a lot of them weren't that public.
Right.
They weren't linked to from anywhere. So were they really meant for archiving? And the web is it's this weird thing between, it's public, but not all of it's really meant for the ages.
Right, right.
Right? Not all of it's newspapers, sort of vetted, figured out that it's published. Some of it's just sort of private scribblings that kind of people want to go away. So how do you make this balance? And I think that's a dance that we're all trying to learn from. I'm actually a little amazed by how trusting people are in putting this stuff out. So Yahoo actually did a good job on that one.
okay.
I would give them they warned us, they told us about it, they helped us. Go and deal with it. Other companies, when they go down, like when InfoSeek, which became Go, which was which was part of Disney, when that went down, there was just nothing left. It's just lawyers. And so the idea,
they're like the cockroaches of an apocalypse,
yes,
right?
right, you're right.
It's just nothing here but lawyers and rubble.
Yeah, right. So the idea of actually getting any data out of the game, there's just no way. So you have to be proactive to be able to get these things in general.
Right.
And how do we build robustness? If we're really, Tim Berners-Lee called them pages, right? I mean, there's sort of you sort of think of pages, and well, they ain't. They're shifting and changing at all times. But yes, we're in the 40th year of not just of the internet, not just the web, and we've seen different phases of this whole thing.
Can you describe a little bit about how the Internet Archive works? Like how do your robots that crawl the web, how do they work?
Yes, the Internet Archive has computers that are basically like the stupidest web surfers you can imagine. It starts with a list of sites that it's going to go to, and it goes to the site, it downloads the page and all the images on it, and it clicks on every link in turn and records all those pages, and if there are any new links that we haven't found before, we add them to the bottom of the list. and it just keeps going on and on like that, and it's fairly fast about it. And it tries to make it so that it doesn't hit any site too fast. Otherwise, you get hate mail on you. Anyway, it hurts the net. So we try to go through, and then once it gets as much as we can in our snapshot, we go back and do it again. It's gotten more sophisticated now, such that it tries to get to sites that update more often, and it's more of a continuous crawl. But that sort of snapshot idea is still, it's how search engines work. And we followed very much that same path. And as the Brian from Webcrawler came up with this robot exclusions idea. I think that was from the Star Wars, the no robots signs, and so no robots allowed. So there's an instruction sheet on the front of every website that says robots are allowed to go here and not allowed to go there. And the way the web works is it's an opt-out system, so you're allowed to go and crawl anything unless something tells you not to. That started out basically trying to keep these crawlers from going and hitting buttons that they shouldn't. Remember there was coffee pots and stuff like that, or little things that if you hit buttons it would move things, and these robots would come by and hit these buttons and cause problems. So you'd go and put these instructions on your website to sort of try to keep these robots from causing damage. But now it's mostly for going and sort of keeping people away from things that you don't want archived or in search engines, more for copyright reasons and the like.
So, Katie, how well documented was the early history of the net? I mean, you sort of spoke about like little napkin-like notes with.
Right.
Was it? Did you find yourself doing sort of archaeology, or was it sort of a lot of oral histories that you've got, or was it?
A lot of oral histories. The Babbage Institute in Minnesota had some oral histories. They were so smart to do this. Recollections of people who had died when I started the research, like J.C.R. Licklider, to whom the book is actually dedicated. And
can you tell us a little bit about who he was?
Well, he was a brilliant guy who he was a psychoacoustician. So he, for instance, was interested in things like the cocktail party problem. Do you know what that is? Where you can focus on, if you're at a party, you can focus on one conversation and then something sounds a little more interesting over there, but then you've lost the thread and you're really rude because you're not now listening to that other person, and it's sort of how we process, how our brain actually processes this. Anyway, but he was also, so he was a psychologist, but he was also, and he was Bob Taylor's mentor. And he and Taylor wrote a seminal paper that was in 1961 together, that was sort of, that he was very prescient, Licklider was, and he, in fact, at one point, and this is getting to your question about what kind of archival stuff there was, all of it, none of it was on the net, all of it was on pieces of paper in people's, in fact, Larry Roberts had to go out to his garage to find, this is the guy who doodled the original ARPANET on yellow legal pads. He goes to the garage and finds some dusty old moldy old box, brings it in, and for the first time in years shows me these little pieces of paper with all these sketches. So Licklider, in one of his memos back in the early 60s, dubbed something the intergalactic network. He just had this idea for this kind of world brain. And he was a very sort of clearly early out-of-the-box thinker and inspired people like Taylor to think out of the box. But documenting all of that was really, really hard, because unlike this book, which I will tell you about now, that I just wrote about the story of one piano, a Steinway piano, Glenn Gould's piano, and Glenn Gould was a very famous Canadian musician who, there's a Glenn Gould archive in Ottawa at the National Library, and you go there and you sit there and you go through all this microfiche, and it's there. Which, by the way, I'm a huge fan of microfiche. I don't know what you think, Brewster. And
we're digitizing up a storm.
Right. It's great. So I sat there with the little machine, and the thing you go around. And unlike that, where I had everything at my fingertips, I just needed to go through it and find, pick out the stuff that was about the piano. That this ARPANET stuff was all over the place. Donald Davies had his stuff in England, and he had to go through his old files for us. and he did. And then the guys from BBN, Bolt, Beranek, and Newman in Cambridge, Massachusetts, who built the first IMP, they had old memos and they went through their boxes, and it was because you think, God, this must be really dry and technical, but it was about, in fact, there was all kinds of like sex life stuff that didn't get into the book because it just, I could not
Well, now's your
make
chance.
the case that this was in any way relevant.
ARPANET Babylon. I want to read that.
Is there going to be a late night edition?
No. You know, that's the thing as a journalist, is like, wow, that's really great stuff, but it just wasn't relevant. But I found out all of that. You know, so-and-so was sleeping with so-and-so's wife and blah, 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 while they were working on the blah, blah, blah thing. It's like, why is this relevant? But, yeah, it was, and then getting old photos. Like, there's this, I don't know if we can show this, but Matt, I wrote this book with my late husband, Matt, and he was very much a fan of putting this photo. This is a later edition of the book, and it came out after he died, and I was so sad that he didn't get to see. This was the photo we wanted to use for the original jacket, and this is what it looked like. See all the phones?
Yeah.
So anyway, so getting photos was also a challenge, because who keeps, I mean, Brewster.
Well, okay, but you did something terrific.
What did
there
I
was a
do?
hero thing. So we were just starting the Internet Archive in '96. You'd finished that book and published it, and you had a file box.
Yes.
And I think you gave it to somebody
Right.
at Xerox Park.
Yes, I did.
Which then they went and scanned it, right? Things weren't scanned back then, right? You know,
Right.
this is still, you know, it's hard to believe, but it wasn't. Things weren't, and but they scanned it, and then they had this then they had a CD of it, and then they gave that to the Internet Archive, and it was one of the first things that we'd actually posted as a collection, was the ARPANET collection. And it was the collection of documents that Katie had gone and pulled together for her book. It was another one of those cases where, you know, people say, oh, if you do that, and it comes up every time, right? When we were first doing the web and ways before that, and, you know, on and on and back, is lawyers are going to, you know, rain down from the heavens and kill you. You know, and so we just do it anyway, and see what happened. And turns out nobody in the 13 years since has ever complained about any of the documents that we'd put up. And there are, you know, scans of different journal documents and things about this. But anyway, so your collection, your research history was not only made into a book, but I'm hoping more and more archives become more available.
So I'm just going to open this to the sort of international area of it and use the sentence that I've loved saying for the last 2 weeks, which is, I was just in Kazakhstan. and I was over there sort of doing the normal sort of talk about the internet and trying to work out what we were talking about internet freedom in Central Asia, and really there's not much that you can bring, right? It's somewhat patronizing to come in going, oh, well, I know all about the internet, because everybody knows all about the internet. There was this brilliant research project in the rural hinterland of Tajikistan. And they basically went in and said, and talked to these very sort of poor mountainous groups, what do you think of the internet? And they went, it's great. And there's these little statistics. It's very carefully collected, and I can reveal to you now that in the urban areas of Tajikistan, they tend to prefer Google more than Yahoo, but in the sort of far off places, they prefer Yahoo over Google. So, you know, pretty much as it is here, right? You know, people sit there going, oh, I use Gmail, I don't use Yahoo Mail, and you know, it's the same thing. But you know, this is a constant. But one of the things that means is when you're sort of talking about the internet, and I found that my role often is to retell these stories, right? Is to actually provide some context, because the internet is a given, but when you talk about sort of like freedom of speech or censorship, you know, there's a chunk of it which is about, well, this is just very hard on the internet. It's a distributed system. There isn't any, you know, the centralized control isn't as strong as it would be in systems previous to this. But then I always spend a bit of time also talking about the cultural background of the people that were developing this, right? You know, when you speak to someone, you know, in most places, they have an idea of Americans and then they have an idea of Californians, right? So the French, for instance, if you tell a French person that you're American, often they, but if you say you're from California, yeah, that's okay. And so I have to sort of explain that, a lot of the internet, I put up a picture of John Postel and Whit Diffie. And I said, so these are some of the people who developed the internet. Right, and I say, so what do you notice about them? And everyone goes, they have huge beards. And you say, yeah, and that's not like, you don't see many American politicians with beards as big as this. And that's because, and then you go into this sort of cultural description. And I hedge it by saying these are ridiculous stereotypes that I'm sort of presenting here. Because, I don't want to explain academia and all of these things. But what's definitely, well, let me check. And I can go back to Kazakhstan and tell them if it's true. But one of the challenges of recording these early days of the internet was that it wasn't from the established places that you would expect the next big computer system to come from. Is that true?
It's a huge, important point because they were given tremendous freedom. There was no big expectation. They were fooling around. It was just an academic experiment. There was nothing at stake. It wasn't like, if you think about it, think of MCI mail. Remember that back in, what was it, 1984?
Basically, yes.
Right. And in fact, Vint Cerf, he wrote some of the important software for MCI mail. And he called it once a dog's breakfast of whatever. But anyway, but there you've got it. If it's done within the corporate setting, you're going to want things to be proprietary, and that's why the internet wasn't proprietary. It's why TCP/IP was not. It's why it won out over these other, there was a huge, let's not forget, and this is a huge, big historical point, is that there was a time, and unfortunately John Postel has died, so he was one of the big proponents of, his name is usually associated with the whole domain name thing in ICANN, but he actually was one of the huge proponents of openness. And there was, for a long time, a fight about whether what standards would be adopted for the internet. Back in the early days, would it be proprietary, with something called OSI, or would it be TCP/IP? And you guys know this, but we don't all know this, and it's really, really important to emphasize because it's a huge...
It could have all gone wrong.
It could have all gone wrong. And once, when I was working on the book, I sent John this funny little email that just popped into my head. We got to be really good friends, and John Postel and I said, just curious, because you're right, he was this total hippie. In fact, his entire family, I went to his house once, and on the refrigerator there's a picture of the whole family, and they've all got these, like, even his mother and no, I take that back. But the whole family is like really hippies, and they're wonderful, and he had this wonderful girlfriend. He lived in this hippie place really right up until the day he died. He lived like a pauper. And I said to John, this huge giant, when it came to the internet, I said to him in this email, so why have you never wanted to get rich off this thing? And I don't even know if I saved that email because, as we know, this whole problem, like it's on some like 10 machines ago, and I don't know if I still have it. But he basically said, what I did was a community, it's like it was like a public service. It never even occurred to him, probably until I asked him that question. And I just love that about the early guys.
No.
Oh yeah, right. Katie, now that you bring it up.
I think John Postel did something. I sort of think over sort of some of the big ideas that I think will outlive the internet. And one of them is the one that Postel put in the domain name service. And it's an ontology. It's a sort of how to divide up things, right? Aristotle did it, to try to figure out sort of earth, wind, and water, whatever, all these sorts of different approaches to try to figure out how to categorize things. And he did something quite amazing, which was the top-level domains.
Right.
And it's very insightful.
Explain what this all is.
So the .com, so it's .com, .org, .gov, .edu, .mil.
.mil, don't forget
and
.mil.
What I find is amazing, you could have cut things all sorts of different ways, but he did those. And they're interesting because more and more I hear people say, oh yeah, I'm a .org, or I'm a .com, or you can know how I'm motivated. You know what I'm for, what my goal structure is, and they're very different to have a .edu, you know, in this general ontology of organizations. I found that to be fascinating.
But the other thing is that someone like Pastel would postpone making it stands out in the domain name system just because that's like the minimalist amount of that kind of positive statement that you could make, right? If in sort of an MCI mail kind of world, you can absolutely imagine somebody sitting down and working out this huge ontology beforehand, right? And having an incredibly complicated one. And what was fascinating is that it's constantly deferring policy, right? Going, well, you know, if we really have to, let's come up with 3 top-level domains, right? But let's try and build a system that decision can be postponed as long as possible. And you know, a lot of it has evolved, right? I mean, it's fascinating to see, you know, what happened to .us. Like, you know, it was
Failed.
why? Well, yeah, but why? I mean, you know, all of the other top-level domains didn't fail, and .us weirdly became this backwater. And you know, there are lots of ifs and buts on what might have happened.
Sorry, no, it's interesting also. I mean, I was just thinking because you're obviously from the UK, but the UK domain systems work differently than the American ones. Like they're set up differently. Don't you have like .ac.uk?
Yeah,
like
that's
that?
right. And they used to go backwards. One of the moments, one of the big moments when you said, you know, internet red letter days, was that when the UK system, Janet, the academic system, linked up with the US system, the US systems went blah blah dot US or whatever, or .edu, and the UK ones went UK.ac. the other way. And so there was this sort of decision, like, which way do we drive on which side of the road? And eventually, like, I think for a little bit, the British system worked both ways. And then eventually it just kind of flipped. All right,
I didn't know that. That's really interesting.
yeah.
Well, I know that in doing research that I've done about the internet in other parts of the world, that I know, for example, South Korea, which is one of the most wired countries in the world now, adopted the British domain system deliberately. They decided we're going to have like the .ac academic,
right.
.kr for Korea,
Right. Or .co.cr.
right, things like that, right.
So I think another way of viewing sort of this 40-year history is I think we're in the 3rd war of the internet.
What does that mean?
So I'm glad you asked. So the first war, I think, is the one that was this openness or closeness, right? Is it going to be IBM Net, whatever it was? There's SNA Net, there's DECnet. There are these sort of proprietary awful things, and there was this ISO standards process. Crud, didn't work. And so but it was really the sort of the bellheads versus the academic open folks that
so the
hippies,
the
the folks
bellheads were the telephone company.
Right, 'cause back then there weren't a lot of the, I don't know, hacker camps or sort of these sort of independent things. A lot of things were done within universities, when national labs. There was government support for a lot of this sort of fairly open type things, which I'm not quite sure what happened to it, but that's a different issue. So there's, and that war went on, and we won, right? The open world won out of that, and we ended up with TCP/IP, and it took off. You never quite win these wars forever, because now AT&T is back. Isn't it cynical that, you know, we blew apart AT&T. We took it apart because it was a bad idea to have a monopoly, and now they come back together again, and they called it the same thing. The cynicism. Anyway, so
they
there's
always
those wars.
have the plans for the Death Star.
It's astonishing to me. Anyway, so it's never quite completely done. But then the next that really played out in the 1980s, I think of by this in terms of the real commercial push and pull. The 1990s was the sort of protocols and software. Who's going to dominate that? Was that going to be owned? Was that? And I take the two real players there is AOL versus the web. Right? Is it going to be a closed garden, everything's safe, and everything, it's all prescribed, you're a member, or is it going to be this wild World Wide Web thing, doesn't quite work, it's it kind of hits these problems, but it's kind of interesting out there. That was playing out, and is somebody going to control these protocols? So AOL and Microsoft was working to try to compete against that with Blackbird. But when Netscape really started to become popular, Microsoft started to turn its turrets, right, and just moved away from AOL. And there's some fantastic dramatic moments of Ted Leonsis from AOL going and calling John Doerr, from funder of Netscape, up and putting him in front of him and say to Microsoft, kill him first. And they did. And so there was this war about protocols. And so by the launch of Windows 95 in August of 95, Microsoft basically had adopted the open protocols, and so AOL was soon to follow. We kind of had browsers, and open source software was kind of working. And that one actually is in pretty good shape today. Linux is doing well. We've got some open source browsers out there that are doing fairly well. Actually, the open source software layer is doing fairly well. The third war, I think, really started around 2000, and it's around the content layer. So where there's plumbing, sort of just getting the networks to work. There's the software layer on top of it, which took a whole nother decade to try to get to work. I mean, we sort of thought the internet worked, but do you remember trying to surf the web when you had to get on the web by going and typing AT with commas to try to get on the net? I mean, it sucked. Anyway, so but we got that kind of working, and now we're in the third war of the internet, which is the content layer, and it's the layer of is somebody going to control the commons, right? There's this possibility of having the greatest sort of shared, interesting area, and I'd say that sort of the major players there sort of it's the commons versus Google, in terms of those that are trying to sort of containerize and say it's mine, owned. You know, you can only get it from me, or is it going to be a Larry Lessig kind of world out there? And I find that the most interesting is the content layer. That really what we were building up to, at least in my sort of view of this internet adventure so far, is making it so people can express themselves in new and interesting ways. Peter Lyman said, he's the former librarian from UC Berkeley, said probably the most interesting or powerful thing about the web is it gives knowledge an address. When knowledge has an address, you can do interesting things with it. You can build on it. You can point to it. You can comment on it. You can do, there were citations before, right? And that was the scientific method, and it worked. But it was clunky. But the hypertext link made it so that knowledge had an address. And so I don't know where it's going future, but I think we're right in the middle of, is the content layer going to be controlled or not?
Katie, when you finished your book in '96, was it like, okay, that's the history of the internet now? Did you, because
show's over.
Right, that's it. I mean, what do you think of all of that Brewster's described since '96?
Yeah, that's such a good question. Well, I remember when the book came out, so it was 1996, it was, I forget when exactly, maybe in the summer, and the web, you know, I guess I had just started working for Newsweek. I'm trying to remember, and they had just started this technology section called Focus on Technology, or maybe it was like in '94 that they started it, and they recruited me to write some of the pieces, and I remember that I had to describe the web, and I just didn't, I called it, remember we journalists used to call it the multimedia part of the internet, you know, sort of this ancillary sort of annex, you know, to the internet.
Color TV.
But I also remember around the time the book came out, and so we've got two separate things. We've got this sort of history, which was a self-contained history, and we had to actually decide when to end it. And we decided to end it at the point where the last IMP for the ARPANET was shut off, because that was the birth of the internet and the sort of the end of the ARPANET, and that was a nice way to end it. But when the book came out, I remember going to Matt, my late husband's office, and he said, I have something to show you. So this must have been actually before the book came out, because it was around when the web first started. He said, I have something to show you, and he brought me over to his computer, and he showed me this picture of a parrot. And I said, how nice, dear. And he said, that is over in, Geneva. And I said, whoa. And I thought, this is really amazing. And that was the web. That was my, I mean, everyone must remember the first time they saw their first web page. So, but I, having no vision at all, was very impressed. I thought it was pretty neat, but I had absolutely no clue that it would turn into what it turned into. In fact, in 1998, I was sitting there doing my little work, and I worked at the New York Times, and I was, I don't know, writing some dumb story, and the phone rings, or I get email from Dennis Allison, who is at Stanford and is a computer scientist, wonderful guy, and he said, I'm helping these kids start this company. It's a search engine company. I said, Dennis, why do we need another search engine? So that's just to let you know that I am totally without vision.
Is it safe to assume that was Google?
That was Google. And however, I have to say that I'm certainly not alone. I mean, I think a lot of what we've done is, as they say, we've sort of stumbled upon the future. What I like to think about the net and the web, or as my daughter, my 16-year-old calls it, the interwebs, is. Do a lot of people say that? Because I thought it was so incredibly funny when I heard that.
No, I remember.
She and her friends call it the interwebs.
No, it's a gloriously ironic way of explaining what old people get confused about.
Right,
when they say
right. Or as George Bush called it, the internets.
Right.
So anyway, I think that a lot of us didn't see it coming, because what it turned into was this really, as Brewster said, this evolutionary thing where these wars sort of started piling on each other, and it has become, I think, the greatest reflection of humanity in all of its best and worst guises. And that's what we've got now, On the other hand, I mean, I'm not really I'm going a little bit forward with your question. I'm helping someone, Bill Davidow, who's a really brilliant, he's a venture capitalist, started More Davidow Ventures. He was at Intel for a long time, and he's working on this amazingly wonderful book, and I'm helping him, called Overconnected. And the thesis, and Brewster doesn't really agree with me, and I tried to call Bill earlier. Bill, if you're listening, I tried to call you earlier to get your permission to talk about this, because the book hasn't come out yet. But the thesis is basically that what the internet has done, unlike anything really in our history, has created this sort of supercharger. And a lot of our institutions have had trouble adapting to the speed with which things now happen. And I won't say anything more than that, but we've got some wonderful, I will say that we have an entire chapter on Iceland, and how when the internet came to Iceland in the form of these online banks, here was this incredibly isolated country that had really been doing just fine, thank you very much, for many, many years. And the fact that that online banking arrived in Iceland, when it did, they started going to Britain, as you know, and with these online banks, people were getting very, very good interest rates. It turned into an absolute huge mess, and it was all thanks to the internet as accelerator. Things went so fast, it's sort of gotten to the point where you can blame a lot of the 2008 global financial crisis on the fact that things were done like this. In IM messages, these transactions went so quickly. There were no throttles. There was no way to sit back and think. We had no ability, because we were going so fast, there were no brakes on the system. And so that's one of these incredible, they talk about unintended consequences. That is an amazing unintended consequence of the internet. And it also speaks to what I said earlier about how it reflects humanity. I mean, that's what we were doing, and we were doing it really, really fast because we could, and we were out of control. It's the whole subprime. I mean, we could get into that, which we probably won't, but if you look at what the internet has been behind, it's really pretty amazing.
wanted to ask Brewster about how does, as an archivist and as somebody who's looked at the web and the internet for a long time, does the internet look different, feel different, taste different in other countries? Does the Icelandic web or the Chinese web or the Brazilian web look fundamentally different than the web that we interact with, the kind of Eurocentric Anglophone web?
I wish I had a great answer. I really don't know. We collect it all. We work with national libraries around the world to try to collect their country's web pages. It seems a little anachronistic, but France wants to have all web pages from the .fr domain, so they contract with the Internet Archive to do it for them, and we build the machines and send it to them and then run it as a Wayback Machine in their third level basement that they have sort of cataloged next to, I don't know, something else. And but it's
Belgium's internet.
Yeah, that's right. And so it's kind of curious that this is going on.
Is France the only country that does that?
Oh no, we work with a bunch of. Well, we basically tried to embarrass countries into it by going and saying you should be doing this. I went to Japan in '98, maybe something like that, to their National Diet Library, the equivalent of the Library of Congress, and they were thinking about archiving the web. And they had this whole thing, and they wanted to have an international conference to discuss it. And so I said, well, what do you do when you go to Japan? You come with a gift. So I brought them everything ever published, the whole Japanese web. And it fit on a computer, and it was a little Wayback Machine. And so I said, and I got to open up in this little conference. And so I started showing the Wayback Machine of their website. So clicked on Yahoo Japan from 2 years before, and they were, oh yeah. You can see them sort of bounce a little bit on the chairs, right? Through the translation, and then I said, okay, and here's your current prime minister's website, and here's the prime minister in 1996, and there was this sort of. It was very quiet. I have no idea. It was this cultural side. Am I going to leave the room alive? and there was a cultural context that I didn't know. Right? It was very sort of. I look back at that as kind of arrogant to have sort of gone in, because there's this quiet comments from the director of the library later. It's like, why should you have the Japanese websites?
Ooh.
And that wasn't the question I really knew how to answer. So there was it was very different worldviews.
I thought it was going to be like a George Bush thing, and they were going to go, "Oh, we don't remember him."
So there's this different cultural settings have very different ways of viewing information and storage, and how the internet has sort of blurred a lot of that, such that we don't have quite the national divisions that we used to have, but exactly how it plays out in different areas, I wish I had better information. Korea seems to be really hot on the web. When we were doing these different studies of countries and sort of activity and the amount of materials and the amount of use, the United States really isn't running this thing for long. It's
not. I don't think it is now.
Yeah, it's probably long gone. And so the United States may have started it, but it's spread, but also I think other people have taken up the leadership mantle in many of the areas when we're just not that aware of it because we
Donald Davis started it in London. No, well, I guess we should open this up to like the people who've been behind us all this time. I've only just noticed, and people on the internet. But one of the things that I sort of end up, it's interesting, is that I think that people often see the internet as sort of exporting an American idea. But, actually, the amount of freedom of speech and other sort of values on the internet are actually not necessarily the standard American value. In 1996, when people were fighting over whether the internet should be censored, or whether the indecent material should be online, I don't think that it was the standard American point of view that pornography on the internet would be fine, an okay thing. I think that was a value that emerged out of the internet rather than be an American value that's been exported to other countries. I think there are just as many American people who are kind of shocked and a bit sort of transformed by the values of the net as there are in other places.
Well, I was going to ask, do you think that it was the personalities, the characteristics of people like Pastel, Surf, Kleinrock, that we have to I mean, is it not an accident that the internet is what it is because of those people?
On one level, definitely. What Brewster was talking about, definitely with the sort of those early wars, because people like Vint worked really, really hard on the openness issue.
Yeah.
And
setting up a whole sequence of how do you make decisions.
right.
The IETF, the IESG, the Internet
Yeah. Engineering
Steering Group, the Internet Engineering Task Force,
yeah.
were whole structures of how do you evolve this within an open context. And Vint Cerf spent a lot of time trying to make those sorts
Yeah.
of things work.
Yeah, Pastel too. Really wonderful guys. So yes, but you know, then there's this. But then, how can you say that it reflects their personality that we're having these content wars, as you say? Brewster and I were talking on the way over here, and I write books, and I'm in the middle of pitching a new book, and I had a long talk with the agent today, and we're talking about the proposal, and he's a great guy, and we're talking about this very traditional way of pitching a book, proposing a book, and that means he'll take the proposal to publishers who will lock up the rights. They'll do a horrible job of promoting it. I'll end up having to promote the whole thing. They take, you know, most of they give me this teeny tiny little royalty. Then I'm lucky, you know, if they actually get it into the bookstores, versus this entirely new idea that Brewster is really behind, which is just do it yourself. And what paralyzes me as an author is, yes, but I'm caught. I'm caught because of the things the publisher can give me, but there's also the mindset. There's this kind of content mindset, because people immediately, you say, I'm working on a book, and people say, the first thing they say is, oh, do you have a publisher? So that's the first sort of status symbol, and then, oh, who's your publisher? It's like, oh, Simon & Schuster. Oh, great. And versus, well,
it's on geocities.com.
So how do we change that?
We've got to make one thing that when I worked on Waze, which came before the web and before Gopher, and talking with publishers, is that I said, you can make money by publishing on the net. By going with an open world, you can control the distribution of your work in a way that you can actually have your business model survive, as opposed to handing it all to an AOL or a LexisNexis or whatever the things of the day. And the thing that we haven't done well is really help a lot of people make very much money on this net.
Well, we've made a few people
an awful lot. But as sort of the web has evolved, there's been this advertising model, which we know how that movie ends. It's not good. There are a few conglomerates that go and run advertising networks, and it tends to be very centralized, and you end up with Clear Channel, right? Or, you know, something, which was the American radio network, whatever is left of it. And it doesn't foster real, it doesn't have like a tradition like book publishing did for the last 400 years. So how do we go and now take an infrastructure that's very good at universal access to free stuff, which is what I think we've now built, and how do we get it to universal access to all knowledge, to make it so that authors would be willing to go and participate and try to get these things up and running? And we're missing a couple key pieces. One is having people actually make money without centralized control, because if there's centralized control, somebody will figure out how to exploit it in such a way that they're the only ones that make money. So a distributed money-making system, and a system that you actually have libraries be able to participate. And there's some work now going on to try to have actually paying for things going across the net. When Steve Jobs and Apple went and made it so that you could buy music from the iTunes store to your iPod, that it went over the internet. Actually, most people didn't care or know. And with the Kindle, they don't even know that I'm not sure it even does touch the internet. Between your Kindle and the Amazon store, both of those showed that people are willing to pay money for bits that they're going to only experience on their device. And that is a breakthrough that we didn't have 15 years ago. If we can now take that momentum, this is my hope, it's my hope, that take the momentum that shows that, okay, somebody can do it in a closed world. Can we make a distributed environment where people can, from your device, pay to go and download something, and you own a copy. I'm a big fan of, actually, you own things that you buy as opposed to this sort of EULA crud. And libraries can also exist within this world, and you'd actually have a distributed number of people making money rather than a couple of ad networks controlled by very, very few people.
Should we?
Sure.
Do we have questions from the internet?
Go.
What were you going to say there real quick? It's funny that you brought up Apple in mentioning the iTunes store, because it seems like the App Store for the iPhone is exactly that. I mean, sure, it's controlled by Apple, but you've got all these developers now who are able to actually, make
No,
money in
let's stop with
applications.
that first part of that sentence. Sure, it's controlled by Apple. That's a very
I'm not saying
big
it's the right
conception.
answer, but
Right, until
That's not an open system.
I agree. But it's a stepping stone. It's getting there. It's just like
It may be getting there.
Yeah.
And if we can take the momentum of bits over the wire you pay for,
right.
and make it so that it's a distributed system, we will have moved the network, the internet, to a generation that is sustainable. Right now, we've got something that's absolutely fabulous, and we're getting better and better at figuring out, convincing people to give stuff away. And even funding things like Wikipedia to give things away. Great, amazing, but we've got some more pieces to go.
So you'd like to see an open version of the Apple Store?
Let's see an open version of the Apple Store. Let's see an open version of the book selling system so that anybody can post their books for whatever price. And if Katie's book, she posts it for $9.95, if enough people come, she's happy. If it's really only worth $3.99, I'm sorry. But let's make it so that people could, as easily as making a web server, make a book server. So a book server would allow you to either sell or lend books, or an app server that would allow you to sell or lend apps, music server, and make it so that there are lots of winners.
Yep.
And right now we have very, very few.
I totally agree.
The open source model that you're talking about, effectively.
It's an
Right.
open architecture, but have money. So don't necessarily go and cast all money away. I know I have a .org on the end of my email address, but yes.
I mean, I think that one of the questions you have to ask about, like, the Apple Store is, well, okay, which bit of this is the bit that triggers I don't mind paying 99 cents. And I don't, for instance, think it's the bit where Steve Jobs decides what's in the Apple Store. I don't think that. I think he thinks that. I think he thinks that it's the good taste of Apple that makes people want to pay 99 cents. But I have an Android phone, right? And the market there isn't as good as the App Store. And there's still an element of Google being in that space and controlling that. But there's not that kind of filter. There's a sort of reputation system going on, and it's like Steve Jobs' opinion and somebody else's opinion. So that's not the control element that's making people pay money. Just in the same way as, like, people paying for ringtones, right? Like, that's something that often breaks those of us who come from the free internet kind of way. It sort of breaks our head a bit, because you're sitting there going, people are paying like $3.99 for 3 seconds when we can't even get them to pay 99 cents for a whole song. But it's not as clear cut as either the very strong people who want to wrap DRM around everything, and those of us who've come from a background of just going, this is just going to have to all be for free, and that's just the way it is. I think that there's a lot of extra psychological stuff in it.
So I was sort of wondering about that, because you were sort of saying that that third war was a content war, and I was wondering if it's possible that that third war is actually going back to being a hardware war. Because when I think about, you know, why do people go to the Apple Store versus the Android store, it's because I know a lot more people with, I mean, I don't have either of these things, with iPhones than with Androids. And therefore, people who are developing apps feel like they're going to get their satisfaction in the Android store. Why do people put books on Amazon? It's because there's so many people there. I've been, you know, the Nook just came out. I'm sort of tempted about trying to ask for it for my birthday or something. But to me, it's like I would really like something where the author can sell me the book directly. I'm kind of holding out for that reader. And
Yes.
I have
Please do.
I
We've got
have
a book coming out for you.
for Katie, I have a friend actually who maybe some of you know, Robin Sloan, who just quit his job at Current TV. He's been soliciting us to like support him. We've put up $12,000 to pay for his book that he's writing, and he's going to publish it in paper and then give it out for free after those of us who've ransomed the paper copies get our paper copies. But the real thing is there's no device to read that on. That's an open device. If we buy it on the Kindle, we have to have the Kindle, and he doesn't get that same
Yes,
cut.
I think.
And so it seems like it's about the devices at some level.
Well, that the devices are starting to assume a closed world, that they're tied. It's reminiscent of pre-internet, or the game machines were never really part of that of the open environment. Cell phones were also sort of part of this alternative universe to the internet, and there's this idea, and it's still really true, that it's very difficult to make money on the internet. So if you go and leave the internet behind, skip the internet, go, you know, oh yeah, maybe there's some TCP/IP connecting, but it's really about your Kindle connecting to the store. And that we will have lost something that we just spent 40 years building. And so building and buying open book readers that can connect not only to Amazon and not only to Google, but to Simon & Schuster directly, or to Katie's new book server site that would be on all of her past works, that we basically have a World Wide Web, again, but with the added components. So if there was something that I would like to add on that would build a more robust, so that we, you know, meet again in 60 years and not look back on the internet and go and say, oh, well, that was kind of an interesting,
nice.
you know, that was kind of cute until, you know, we basically got overrun by closed format machines talking to closed format services over closed format networks that were all licensed. We have this amazing, right now these machines are general purpose machines. When I was looking at these things in the mid 80s and I was trying to figure out sort of, you know, okay, how are we going to build this library? I said, it was really amazing to go and think, these computers, you could actually go and write software, give it away for free, and that computer would become kind of yours. You could get something out to 1 million people without having to fight your way through the retail system and all of that. And that was amazing. That wasn't the way it used to be. And we could lose it. We could lose it.
I don't think that's going to happen. There's enough hackers out there that like to break closed systems that it's just not going to happen.
But it'll be the fringe. I mean, yes, you can jailbreak your iPhone, but how many people do? Does it encourage it? Is it the way?
And if you criminalize it, right, then you can build no industry on top of that.
Right.
as
Well, true, but that's what you're here for. But just to get back to your point earlier, you were Danny's point. You were saying that there's this magic bit there that encourages people to buy an app, and it's something about the platform and the quality of the product and the price point. There's some sort of magic mix there that isn't just the essence of Steve Jobs or just the cachet of Apple, but there's something there, and I think that could be extrapolated to a marketplace, an open marketplace, or some sort of way that if we can capture whatever that magic is and apply that to a book server market or you know, any other sort of open marketplace, then we've won.
Some of it, I think, is just the magic of a delusion, right? A lot of people like put their stuff on the App Store because they think they're going to make $1 million, and no one, you know, the number of people who actually make that kind of money on an App Store product is minimal. And it's the same in the publishing industry, right? You know, the reason why people are so paranoid about having a book to sell is because they have it in their mind that their book might be the new Harry Potter, In fact, like 12 grand is great for like a first book, right? That's basically what you can imagine to make. So that model has already beaten the publishing industry into a cocked hat, right? That's just better than their system all in all. Now, if it becomes like a million bestseller, then 12 grand isn't so great, right? But the probabilities are good for that. I wanted to ask Katie. So you talked a lot about how the moment of the internet was like everybody was coming up with these ideas at the same time. The moment was right for ARPANET. What in this battle between open and closed, do you think the things that win it is the enthusiasm and sort of like the dedication of like a few individuals, or do you think it's kind of a given?
Well, I think back then, when people like Vin were fighting very hard for an open network, I think it was, in fact, the hard work and the enthusiasm that prevailed. And I'm a total cynic about capitalism, because I think that now we're in a very different environment and the stakes are much, much higher. And so it becomes much uglier. And that's why when Brewster said, when Microsoft turned its huge ship around and noticed that there was the internet out there and they went after, and that's what prompted the whole antitrust thing and the bundling of the browser, and it became a very, very high stakes game. And so enthusiasm, while quaint, is actually in this context not the ticket. I don't know if Brewster agrees with me, but I might be a little bit cynical, but I think that when we've got sort of this huge monster of Google, has anyone here ever tried to live a Google-free day? It's really,
in that village.
Right, in that village, like on the edge of the earth. I mean, this is what makes it very, very difficult. And also, we've got Google, we've got these mind games that Google plays with us. And, I use Google as much as the next guy. I mean, not you, of course, but, I use Gmail and through, all of us do. However, they really, it's scary because it's the do no evil mantra, but at the same time, they are very, very, very strategically eating Microsoft for breakfast and getting all of us, under their their umbrella, on their servers, and very much on their servers. And that's why I say enthusiasm is just fine, but it's not in this context where there's so much at stake. It won't prevail.
But from the point of view of a mythology and sort of a culture, it's the Vint Cerf and the wizards who stay up late, right? That's the very culture that Google presents and employs, right?
Yeah. Okay, but let's take some of the people that made a lot of the underlying technologies were like the Postels or the Tim Berners-Lee. Mm-hmm. Tim Berners-Lee is, I think, like the diplomatic, the British diplomat. Right, when the British Empire was conquering the world, he would be the man that would still be a civil servant, going and helping administrate Hong Kong. So there are people going and making bazillions of dollars in corruption, all sorts of, and then there'd be this quiet gentleman there going and trying to make sure that things sort of proceeded along okay. And he dedicated his career, not making a lot of money, to help administrate the growth of something great. And so email, FTP, net news, the World Wide Web, all were open protocols. And they were internationally standardized things. If you think of the last 10 years of what are the big protocols that have come out, whether the big things, whether it's Twitters or the voice over IP, they're not open. Right. If you take Skype, Skype, it's not open. So the whole last generation, we need more Tim Berners-Lees. We need more institutional support. We need more of these national labs. We need universities that actually take this as an important aspect to help run and build up protocols that are good enough to make it actually fly. Otherwise, I think we'll end up with just companies not thinking very broadly, just thinking about their self-interest to try to corner some particular area. And so it is doable. I think that actually you can make openness work in a very competitive environment by balkanizing and causing it to happen to other people. There's ways you can use openness as a weapon. Google, again, is very, very good at it. You try to commoditize everybody else's business. So Google wants to commoditize the phone companies' businesses. I'm all in favor of it, right? I'm in favor of all openness. But usually it's coming from, I want to protect mine, but I want yours to be commoditized and open. And the government, if it were done well, would just say, okay, true, let's just make sure everybody's open. And we're not quite there yet. We'll see if net neutrality makes it through. But that's coming up against enormous backlash. Why?
Did that surprise you?
Yes. I mean, doesn't it seem like a no-brainer? I mean, it's like, duh, and it's like, and we're still getting a real fight over it. It's like orphan works, having people object to having the orphans freed.
You should explain what orphan works are.
Orphan works are things that were caught in copyright limbo because in '76 they basically copyrighted everything, and the first real wheel off the cart when this happened was actually software. And I was at MIT and we were building list machine software, and suddenly it was all owned. It was all community property before that. We didn't even sign our code. There was not a tradition of signing code because that would be, it's that same Postel era. And so we didn't sign it, and suddenly it was all owned. And Richard Stallman blew a fuse because suddenly his life, work that he'd been spending on, and all of us had been spending on, was packaged and sold to a company called Symbolics. And it was all because, as best I can tell, because the copyright law changed. It flipped. And because we have this copyright law, the software broke. And he said, this is nuts. And said, okay, we'll have to go and invent a law against it. And it was open source software. And that ran for a while. And books, there's this enormous number of books that are caught in limbo. That they didn't, Ben Franklin said, copyright should last 14 years and renewable once. And you only get copyright if you wanted it. You actually had to go and get a C and send a copy to the Library of Congress. Otherwise, it's not copyrighted. Again, that was all flipped. And an enormous number of books were caught in this limbo. So we said, all right, let's at least free that. Let's take the out of print, the stuff that nobody can find anybody. No authors, nobody's making any money. Let's at least free that to the internet generation. And there's been enormous opposition to it from corners that you wouldn't imagine. And so, yes, we don't have a good system for making decisions at the governmental level. And a lot of the real, I think, the good decisions that have come out in the last 20 years are people that just gone and done it.
I wanted to jump to a question that came to us from the chat, which was somebody was asking about, can you see that? Okay. Someone was asking, is Facebook now kind of the iTunes for people? And I think what that question is getting to is
my head just broke.
I think what that question is getting at is this idea that, you know,
I love that line.
People are, which line?
Is Facebook the iTunes for people? I think it does make you break and rethink.
One of the things I find most disturbing about the modern day, like discussing these internet, is how many trademarks you have to use just to discuss what's going on, right? Is Facebook the Twitter of iTunes? You know, it's like, okay, I'm glad I have like no, it's.
But this is.
I feel the way I interpret that question is, you know, as people are on Facebook and giving out freely information about themselves, and companies are then packaging and scanning and crawling and doing all kinds of information with that data and then making money off of it.
Yes.
Yeah.
What does that mean?
Oh, it's really freaking scary. I mean, you know, it wasn't that long ago when people, for their reading habits, were rounded up and bad things happened to them. And it was by people that, you know, were not that many generations off from us. And so what happens when your reading habits are really that known and your friends, these were all the warnings that I was sent off to college by my parents who went through the McCarthy era. be careful of what clubs you join, because it's clubs later, if they change, it can get you in trouble. And we have a very trusting time, which is the good news, right? That people are trusting and making things available. My sister had a lock on her journal when I was growing up, and that was to keep it from me. I think she would be posting it all on Facebook if she were that age now.
That's interesting.
And there's a great trust going on, and I don't think we have the controls in place. The corporations are taking advantage of this in ways that are
Well, is it
just
trust or is it
ruthlessly.
cluelessness? Like I was talking to the counselor at my daughter's school the other day, and she said, "I cannot tell you these kids. I keep telling them to keep this stuff off Facebook because they are just clueless about what the implications are."
No, I think that's wrong. I think that I don't think that I've never really seen that. I know
Seen
that
what?
that people that people are clueless about what they want to be private and what they want to be
really?
public. I think people are very perhaps more sensitive because they understand that there are graduations to this. I think it's an implementation problem. I think it's it's us geeks' fault, right? In it just so happens that if I want to share a bit of information with 13 of my friends and not to another 12 of
Right.
them, the procedure that's easiest for me to do that is to give it to a third-party multi-million-dollar organization that I know nothing about, and because they have a list of my friends. And I know that sounds like incredibly gullible or naive, but there is currently no other way I could, as a geek,
true.
I really struggle with how to do that. Like I have a blog on my own site where I write about things, and every day I feel the draw of going to like LiveJournal or something else, because if I want the software to control which of my friends sees this and which of them don't, I'd have to write it myself. And why hasn't somebody else written that? Well, because LiveJournal and Facebook have already written it. The itch has been scratched, and so it needs someone like Stormer, who's a brilliant programmer, and has sort of shrugged his shoulders and gone, well, I guess I'm going to have to re-implement the entire operating system that was just stolen from me, again in my own spare time, in order to get those tools back. People don't have the tools to do this.
Any questions from back there?
Yeah, I had a couple. First, I wanted to say earlier about the whole thing about charging, even if it's micro-charging, you've immediately gone into loss of anonymity. Even if it's a penny, how I pay on the internet. And we don't have eCash. It hasn't been working. And it's a really serious problem because we are in that era where they are calling. Did you hear, was it yesterday's news that they're subpoenaing all the student records of the people at the Innocence Project in Illinois? Yeah, that's today's.
Great.
Right? The people that get the death penalty people off? Yeah.
I think yes, money is something that we haven't really. Right? What's the equivalent? Somebody pointed out we fought so hard to get strong encryption to be free, right? So that anybody could use it. And really the only time it's really used is to protect credit card numbers going across the net. And it just seems so sad that really what we're doing is trying to protect banks' interest.
Yeah.
And
I'm
with
not
this,
talking about protecting the banks. I'm just saying, for me to order something, it
You would
has
have-
to come from me in some like PayPal or something that's got my fingerprints on it.
it
and
didn't.
to my
It doesn't.
address. I can't walk in
It
and pay
doesn't
cash.
have to. It doesn't have to. But there are many pieces that aren't built well yet. But there are people that know how to do this. If we were to sort of have a bit of a focus on let's build the next generation pieces of the internet in some of the tradition of where things came from with open protocols, so it could be built in a distributed way, so you'd own and control your own work, we can actually do it.
Because we've been having this problem. I'm involved with NoiseBridge, and we have, like, on Monday nights we have this hardware hacking thing. So this friend of mine came in with one of the little netbooks that the power plug was screwed up. So they opened it up and stuff. And where do you go get one little plug like that? Because Radio Shack has almost nothing. I just heard that the Exploratorium is clearancing out their whole electronics shop. So we're going to get sort of hung out there. Our whole like external brain is going to be running, and then it's going to start breaking down, and the hardware is all going to be gone, all the fixed stuff. So, but the main thing I actually was trying to talk about was just the cognitive model, because I'm 65 actually, so I'm several generations back in terms of how I defined my reality. So if I went out and saw a mountain, the next time I went, I expect the mountain to be there, and so forth and so forth. And so I really noticed when I got the web having the internet, and I would go, one of my favorite little sites was Virtual Crack. You could send your friends a virtual crack. And one day it wasn't there. So the expectation of a whole generation growing up on the internet was that it wouldn't be there. The transiency was much deeper. And I think we've got one of my questions asked now, which is jumping in time on this, is do you think that people really think that they can get out of the end of the world by hiding out in Second Life? And I think there are people that are there. But just, yeah, how we...
Virtual world?
Yeah.
Do you think that's true? I mean, you were talking about the sort of over-connected idea. Do you think that people are expect more transiency in their media now?
You mean, oh, it's here today, but I won't necessarily expect it to be here tomorrow.
And I won't be bothered if it's gone.
I won't be bothered if it's gone. I guess. I mean, it's sort of. Sure. I mean, but the next question to ask is that a bad thing? It is in that it feeds into this attention problem we all have. Now, I don't know about anyone else, but my attention is just shot. But is that necessarily? I mean, is this sort of one of the less heinous byproducts of the internet? I would put it low.
I kind of have the.
Like it's a cognitive change.
Yeah, it is a cognitive change.
I mean, I guess I just kind of have the opposite situation, which is where if I put something on the internet, I do expect the Internet Archive to crawl it. I do expect Google to crawl it. I do expect that anything I put on the internet will probably be there for a long time.
That's actually, I do think that too. I'm really careful about what goes up there. In fact, I have this terrible situation, I probably shouldn't say this, where a few years ago I did this story about Wikipedia. This was the New York Times' sort of big heave on Wikipedia, and I was told by one editor that I should definitely get in touch with this one guy, and I just didn't really feel comfortable, but I did it to appease the editor. And this guy wrote, I sent him an email, innocent email, hi, would you talk to me about Wikipedia? He said, I am not a fan of yours. I will never be a fan of yours. I will never talk to you, Katie Hafner. And I'm like, whoa. And it turns out that because of a book I had written years ago called Cyberpunk about computer hackers, about Kevin Mitnick, he had really held this grudge against me for all these years. And the next thing I know, to Cyrus's point, is there's this, if you Google my name, Katie Hafner, what you'll see in the results is seriously, you know, F-U-C-K, Katie Hafner. And I can't get it off. It is like gum on my shoe, and you have to sort of dig deep to see that he really just holds a grudge against me because of Mitnick. But my gosh, golly gee. I mean, so it's a two-edged thing, isn't it? It's like it's there. I even asked Google, could you help me here? And they're like, sorry. Really, what can you do? Brewster, can I do anything about that? Guess not.
Probably not.
Probably not. So, and so what's interesting, cognitively speaking, is that sort of etches itself into people's brains when they do a Google search, say, on me. It's like, oh yeah, and then she had that weird thing that, you know, on top of all the other results, there was that weird thing that stays there.
Well, yes and no, though, because I think also, you know, there's a much wider range of what people have said now. So they're sort of sitting there going, oh, so there's this weird site here, but you know, New York Times, weird site here. You know, I mean, these things have different reputation levels, right? And I mean, I feel like you know, there's this point where just because someone on the internet hates you, like there's a point where you like that kept me awake a lot, right? And I think it keeps a lot of people awake at night, going, somewhere out there somebody thinks I'm wrong on the internet, right? And then after a while you just go, well, you know, the only reason I'm upset is because I Google myself. And you know, I don't no one has ever sort of like gone, I'm not talking to you anymore because of that crazy kook on the internet. And you know, if they do, it's another crazy kook, and you know, I badge of honor.
Has anyone heard about this new novel that's out, Await Your Reply, about identity theft? I'm in the middle of reading it now. I forget who the author is, Don, C-H-A-O-N, I think. But it's really interesting because it's about this question of, you know, this is kind of another topic, but this whole the second life question that you brought up. It's like, who are we really? And it's
maybe
interesting.
That's a good topic for the next show.
Indeed it is, and I'm being told that we're out of time, so I want to thank Katie Hafner again. Thank you very much. Brewster Kahle, thank you so much. And Danny O'Brien, thank you very much for being here.
Thanks to the audience.
And thanks to you guys, and thanks to you guys out on the internet. If you can see me, I think you can. And good night. Thank you.